The Confederacy demanded the Union give them Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Outgoing President Buchanan refused. Then President Lincoln refused as well. A few weeks later, the South bombarded the fort and captured its 80-odd Union troops. There were no casualties on either side. The entire Union garrison in Texas, said to be 1/4 of the U.S. Army, peacefully surrendered to the South, then turned around and joined the Confederacy. Remember, the Founding Fathers did not believe in large standing armies, and the Union indeed did not have one. Lincoln immediately called for the recruitment of 75,000 soldiers and the creation of state militias, and the war was on. Up in Washington, there was a huge change as some Southerners resigned their seats in the House and Senate, and others actually were expelled for supporting the Confederacy, many to take similar positions in the Confederate Congress or to take up arms. The good news was that Northern and Western Republicans now really controlled the government and were able to pass bills that Southerners had previously blocked. The United States never gave diplomatic recognition to the Confederacy. Lincoln would not negotiate any treaty, large or small, as it would have seemed to be acknowledging them as a sovereign government. Officially, the Civil War is called the War of the Rebellion. These days, there are available endless numbers of books, websites, documentaries, and Hollywood movies on the battles and the details of the War of the Rebellion. It's not our purpose to replow that ground. If you choose to become a Civil War buff, let me warn you, it can be as addictive as liquor and tobacco. Between 1861 and 1865, there were a dozen or so major, lengthy campaigns. There were hundreds and hundreds of fights, skirmishes, and smaller battles. For you local folks, there were two in Arizona. One, we're told, was over on the Colorado River near Yuma or Ehrenberg. Reportedly, it was little more than a bar fight. The other was at Picacho Peak. The Confederate Army had marched in and taken over Tucson, which was about the only significant town we had. You see, the U.S. troops had left to go back east and fight. The Confederate Congress in Richmond, Virginia, officially declared this area to be the Confederate Territory of Arizona. I've often said that with the Apaches on the warpath again, folks in Tucson were probably glad to have any army back in town. Riding from the west was the Union Army's large California column. A scouting party from that unit ran into a scouting party of Confederates in front of Picacho Peak, maybe 30 miles north of Tucson, today right beside Interstate 10. A skirmish ensued. One or two on each side were killed or wounded, and the Confederates hightailed it back to Tucson to warn their commander that the Union Army was just up the road and closing fast. By the time the Californians arrived, the rebels had packed up and left. That was the Civil War in Arizona. The commander of that California column was Colonel James Carleton. When he arrived in Tucson, he, without any authority, declared this to be the U.S. territory of Arizona. Neither Carleton nor anyone else had any idea of what the boundaries of the territory were supposed to be. In Washington, a few months later, after congressional action, President Lincoln signed what is called the Organic Act, and we were finally, there in 1863, an official territory under the provisions of the Northwest Ordinance, a law originally passed by the Confederation Congress, not to be confused with the Southern Confederacy, but the Congress of the Articles of Confederation, our government prior to the U.S. Constitution. President Lincoln was required to appoint our first territorial officers, a governor, a secretary, etc., and 3 judges. The first governor was John N. Goodwin, who was originally appointed a judge. But when the actual first governor, John Gurley, died before taking office, Goodwin was moved up. But the more significant of the original territorial officers was a man named William T. Howell, appointed as one of the 3 court justices. Howell was from Michigan, where he earlier served as a district attorney, then was an elected state senator, and years later a state representative. and was also a court commissioner and a probate judge and a prosecuting attorney. And he argued cases before the United States Supreme Court. So what did this very talented man do that was so special for Arizona? Well, it would take the new territory several months to organize and elect a legislature. But when that was accomplished, there would not yet be any laws on the books. They'd have to start from scratch. So before there was even a territorial legislature, William Howe, by himself, sat down and started writing a set of territorial statutes. He worked on it for many months, covering virtually every subject that Arizona would need. It was our starting point, 400 pages to guide us. Before the first territorial legislature met, Howell's wife back in Michigan became ill, and he returned to be with her. He never returned to Arizona. When the first elected territorial legislature met in Prescott in 1864, the very first action they took was to approve and adopt the Howell Code as Arizona's very first set of laws. Meanwhile, the Civil War was still raging. There are place names famous for battles in the conflict: Bull Run, Antietam, Shenandoah Valley, Chancellorsville, and on and on. As noted, we are not going to detail them here. But there are famous people: Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, Stonewall Jackson, and others. We want to put this whole chapter of American history in perspective with a few stories and the words of some significant players. Be aware, at least early on in the war, the Union forces lost most of their battles. Northern citizens were shocked and dismayed, angry, casualties mounted, a military draft was implemented. And today, in 21st century America, I can't help but look back and wonder, regardless of the cause, how would that somewhat homely fellow named Lincoln, with an army that did not hold its own most of the time, how would Lincoln have been treated by today's 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week news cycle with cable TV channels that have to be saying something every single minute? It's an ugly thought. One of Lincoln's big problems was that the South, at least early on, had better generals. A polite way of saying early on, Lincoln had some poor generals. It drove him nuts. Case in point, Lincoln had a general named George McClellan. He was a very handsome fellow, and he commanded a large army. Now, McClellan would take his force into battle, and initially they'd be winning. When the Confederates might retreat a bit, McClellan would stop fighting, pull his troops back. Not only that, but he would hold back a lot of additional reinforcements who he never committed to the battle. The Confederates escaped to fight another day. Lincoln wanted him to press the fight and destroy the Southern Army once and for all. McClellan also had a bad habit. No matter how many soldiers he had under his command, he constantly requested even more troops so that he might be ready for that big victory down the road. McClellan's other problem was his arrogance. When the general was briefly back in Washington, D.C., the president wanted to talk to him about his approach to war. Rather than calling McClellan to the White House, Lincoln and his Secretary of War went to the general's house. A servant showed the president to the sitting room to wait for McClellan to come down. They sat there for an hour or more. No McClellan. This is the President of the United States sitting in your living room waiting to talk to you. Finally, the servant appeared and said, "I'm sorry, but the general has gone to bed for the evening." Incredible. Well, of course, before long, Lincoln fired McClellan, and I love the way he did it. He reportedly sent a telegram that read, quote, "Dear General McClellan, if you're not going to be using the Army, do you mind if I borrow it? A. Lincoln." This business of having poor generals later ended when Lincoln found Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman and the often unsung General George Meade. When General Grant was prosecuting the war, winning battles, some people came to the president and complained that Grant was a drunk. The president is said to have responded, "Then find out what kind of whiskey he drinks and send a case of it to each of my generals." Sherman, of course, was famous for his scorched earth march across Georgia. He had captured and held Atlanta, but needed to move east to the sea to take Savannah. Rather than extending supply lines over that distance, he divided his army into two groups, each taking a different route, with orders to live off the land, which meant take whatever you need from the folks in Georgia. Oh, and implied in that order was the other part, burn the place down as you pass through. This last part had no real tactical importance. Strategically, however, it demonstrated to the South the futility of continuing the fight, a bit like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, perhaps. But one thing is certain, you won't find any statues of General Sherman in Atlanta. Then there's General George Meade. In the 1860s, Meade's personality was not appreciated by the newspaper reporters, so they wrote little of his successes and a lot about his failures. But even an angry press could not ignore his greatest victory and the most famous campaign of the Civil War, Gettysburg. This fight was among the largest of the war, with 51,112 combined casualties. But it had significance beyond its size. It was the Union victory that put an end to Confederate General Lee's efforts to invade the North. It may surprise you to know that the Civil War saw the highest number of military casualties of any American conflict. Its 620,000 deaths are more than World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. There were also 412,000 wounded. A good question about the war itself is, was it an even fight? The answer is clearly no. We spoke earlier about the Southern economy, but let's look at it in terms of its ability to wage a war. The Union's resources were much greater and could last longer. The Union had more than double the population, even if the South included the slaves in their count. And the Union had almost 4 times the number of men of combat age. The North had 96% of the United States railroad equipment. The North had the shipbuilding industry, a large merchant marine, and naval resources. The U.S. government raised taxes on goods and services. Its treasury issued paper money backed by government credit, which it did have. The South had virtually no credit, and due to the blockade of southern ports, it could not get insurance on its export shipping. Cotton exports fell to 2% of their pre-war volume. The Confederacy printed more currency, about $1 billion worth, causing drastic inflation, and they issued over $150 million in bonds, none of which was ever repaid. A major factor in a war is resources, logistics and supply, food, ammo, soldiers, the material ability to keep fighting. The average Southern soldier likely didn't even know the disadvantages he was operating under. But the Confederate leadership had to know, and we can't resist asking the question, what were you thinking? Here's what they were thinking. If we can just keep the Union paying a price, eventually they'll decide it's not worth it, and they'll just let us become a separate country. It's what we did to the British in the Revolution. It's what North Vietnam did to us. But Abraham Lincoln, U.S. Grant, Sherman, Meade, and others were not going to let that happen. Save the Union. Yes, we owe it to the 260,000 Union dead. Yes, but underlying all of this, once blood was shed, they were going to get rid of slavery once and for all.